The silver recording. The woods had always been Arthur's sanctuary, a place where the clamor of the world receded, replaced by the subtle symphony of rustling leaves, birdsong, and the gentle creak of branches swaying in the breeze. He lived on the edge of the sprawling Blackwood forest, a vast expanse of old-growth trees that swallowed sunlight and sound with equal appetite. His small cottage, inherited from a reclusive uncle, was more a hermitage than a home, and the forest, his truest neighbor. Most afternoons, especially in autumn when the air grew crisp and the light turned a burnished gold, Arthur would walk. He had no set paths, preferring to meander, letting instinct guide his worn leather boots over mossy logs and through thickets of fern. This particular Tuesday was no different, or so it began. The sky was an undecided canvas of gray and pale blue, the sun making brief, almost apologetic appearances. A recent rain had left the earth damp, the scent of wet soil and decaying leaves hanging heavy and sweet. Arthur moved with a familiar ease, his senses attuned to the forest's quiet life. He noted the frantic industry of a squirrel burying nuts, the distant tap-tap-tapping of a woodpecker, the way the light filtered through the thinning canopy, dappling the forest floor in shifting patterns of light and shadow. He felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet contentment that only these solitary wanderings could provide. It was in a less trodden part of Blackwood, where the undergrowth grew denser and the ancient oaks seemed to lean in conspiratorially, that he saw it. Nestled at the base of a particularly gnarled tree, half hidden by a cluster of vibrant, almost unnaturally red toadstools, was an object that clearly did not belong. It was a small, portable tape recorder, the kind that was popular perhaps 2 or 3 decades ago. Its plastic casing was a dull, utilitarian gray, scuffed and scratched, with a fine layer of forest detritus clinging to its surfaces. One side was caked with dried mud, suggesting it had lain there for some time, perhaps through several seasons. Arthur paused, a flicker of mild surprise interrupting his reverie. Litter was uncommon this deep in the woods. People rarely ventured this far. He nudged it gently with the toe of his boot. It was surprisingly solid. He bent down, brushing away leaves and twigs. The cassette compartment was closed, and the buttons, though worn, seemed intact. There was no visible branding, no manufacturer's mark he could readily identify. It was just an anonymous piece of outdated technology, strangely out of place in the timeless embrace of the forest. Curiosity, a trait Arthur usually kept on a tight leash, got the better of him. Who would bring a tape recorder out here? And why abandon it? He picked it up. It felt cool and slightly damp in his hand. He tried the eject button. With a hesitant click, the cassette door sprang open. Inside, a standard cassette tape, its label blank and yellowed with age, was nestled snugly. A strange little thrill, a mix of intrigue and an almost imperceptible unease, ran through him. It was like finding a message in a bottle, a forgotten relic with an unknown story. He closed the compartment, the click echoing a little too loudly in the quiet woods. He should probably leave it, he thought. It was junk. But another part of him, the part that had always been drawn to mysteries, however small, urged him to take it. What harm could there be? He slipped the recorder into the large pocket of his waxed cotton jacket, its weight a small, unfamiliar pressure against his side. The rest of his walk was subtly altered. The peace he had felt earlier was now overlaid with a thin veneer of anticipation, a question mark hanging in the air. The woods themselves seemed a little more watchful, the shadows a little deeper. He found himself glancing back more often than usual, though he couldn't have said what he expected to see. Back in the warmth of his cottage, with a mug of tea steaming beside him, Arthur placed the tape recorder on his sturdy oak kitchen table. It looked even more out of place there, amidst his books and papers, than it had in the forest. He found a couple of AA batteries in a drawer, their expiry date thankfully still some months away. With a sense of minor ceremony, he unclipped the battery cover, inserted them, and snapped it shut. He pressed the play button. Nothing. Just a faint hiss, the sound of empty air. He pressed fast forward for a few seconds, then rewind, then play again. Still the same low hiss. Disappointment, surprisingly keen, pricked at him. Perhaps the tape was blank, or the machine itself was broken beyond repair. He was about to eject the tape and consign the whole thing to the bin when he decided to try fast-forwarding it a bit longer, then rewinding it to what he hoped was near the beginning. He pressed play one last time. For a moment, there was only that same vacant hiss. Then a click. A muffled fumbling sound, as if the microphone was being clumsily adjusted. Arthur leaned closer, his brow furrowed. And then, a sound emerged that made the hairs on the back of his neck prickle. It was a voice. A man's voice. Hoarse, ragged, and utterly, profoundly terrified. "Help me! Oh, please, someone help!" Arthur's breath caught in his throat. The voice was distorted, yes, by the cheap microphone and the age of the tape, but there was an underlying familiarity to its timbre, its cadence, that sent a shockwave of ice through his veins. The voice on the tape let out a choked sob, then a desperate, tearing scream. "No! Please, no! Get away from me! Somebody, help!" Arthur's hand flew to his mouth, his eyes wide with the dawning, sickening horror. He would know that voice anywhere, even distorted by terror, even shredded by panic. He had lived with it his entire life. It was his own. He sat there, frozen, the tea growing cold beside him, as his own voice, captured on that discarded tape, screamed and begged for help from the heart of the silent, watching woods. The recording continued, a litany of fear and pain, his own pleas echoing in the sudden, crushing stillness of his small cottage. The recording ended abruptly, cutting off mid-scream with a sharp, jarring click. Silence descended upon Arthur's kitchen, a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to press in on him from all sides. He remained motionless, his hands still clamped over his mouth, his knuckles white. The sound of his own breathing was harsh and loud in his ears, a counterpoint to the phantom echoes of his recorded terror that still seemed to vibrate in the air. His first coherent thought was one of utter, bewildered denial. It couldn't be. It simply could not be him. It had to be a mistake, a trick of acoustics, a bizarre coincidence. Someone who sounded like him, perhaps. But the longer he sat there, the more that desperate certainty crumbled. The inflections, the way the voice cracked under duress, the specific tenor of the screams, they were undeniably, terrifyingly his. He pushed back his chair, the legs scraping loudly against the wooden floor, and stood up, pacing the small confines of the kitchen. His mind raced, a frantic whirl of questions and impossibilities. How? When? Why? He hadn't been attacked. He hadn't screamed for help in the woods, not today, not ever. He prided himself on his composure, his quiet way of life. This raw, primal terror captured on the tape was alien to his experience, yet intimately familiar in its vocal signature. Could it be a prank? The thought was almost a relief. Some elaborate, cruel joke. But who would go to such lengths? He had few acquaintances, fewer friends, and certainly no enemies he was aware of. And how would they get a recording of his voice, let alone one so distressed? The idea felt flimsy, insufficient to explain the chilling reality of what he had heard. He forced himself to return to the table, to look at the tape recorder. It sat there innocuously, a relic of a bygone era, now imbued with a sinister significance. He picked it up, turned it over in his hands. It was old, certainly, but not ancient. Perhaps from the late 80s or early 90s. He hadn't owned such a device himself in decades. With trembling fingers, he pressed the eject button again. The cassette popped out. He examined it closely. A generic, unbranded tape. The label was blank, as he noted before, but now he scrutinized it under the kitchen light. Were there any faint indentations? Any erased writing? Nothing. It offered no clues. He rewound the tape to the beginning, his heart thudding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. He had to listen again. He needed to be sure, to pick apart the sounds, to find some detail, any detail, that would refute the impossible. He pressed play. The hiss, the click, the fumbling. And then his voice, raw with panic. "Help me! Oh, please, someone help!" Hearing it a second time was no less horrifying. If anything, it was worse. The initial shock had given way to a creeping dread, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. He listened intently, trying to discern any background noises, anything that might give a clue to the location or the circumstances. There was a rustling sound, like leaves or perhaps clothing. A faint, almost inaudible shuffling. But mostly it was just his voice, amplified by the silence of the room. The screams were the worst. They were not just sounds of fear, but of agony, of utter desolation. He didn't recognize the specific words of terror, the desperate pleas, as anything he had ever consciously uttered or even imagined uttering. It was like listening to a stranger, yet a stranger who inhabited his own vocal cords. When the recording ended again with that sharp click, he felt physically sick. He slumped back in his chair, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. This wasn't a prank. The terror in that voice was too genuine, too profound. It was the sound of a man facing something unendurable. His mind turned to the woods, to the spot where he'd found the recorder. The gnarled oak, the lurid red toadstools. Had something happened there? Was this a recording of a past event, something he had witnessed and somehow forgotten? But that made no sense. He would remember an attack, surely. An experience like that would leave scars, both physical and mental. Unless it hadn't happened yet. The thought, unbidden and unwelcome, slithered into his mind, coiling there like a serpent. A recording of the future? Preposterous. Utterly, laughably preposterous. He was a rational man, a man of logic and reason. Such things belonged in fanciful stories, not in the quiet reality of his life. Yet the tape existed. His voice was on it. He had found it. These were undeniable facts. He spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of agitated paralysis. He tried to read, but the words blurred before his eyes. He attempted to busy himself with chores, but his movements were clumsy, his thoughts elsewhere. The recording played over and over in his head, a relentless loop of his own future or past or somehow alternate terror. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and gray, Arthur found himself staring out the window at the encroaching darkness of Blackwood Forest. The trees, usually a comforting presence, now seemed to loom, their branches like grasping claws. The familiar sounds of the evening, the hoot of an owl, the chirp of crickets, were overlaid with the memory of that recorded scream. He had to know more. He couldn't just leave it at this. The uncertainty was a torment worse, almost, than the fear itself. Tomorrow, he decided, he would go back. He would return to the spot where he found the recorder. Maybe there was something he had missed, some clue, some explanation, however mundane, for this deeply unsettling enigma. He had to believe there was a logical answer. He clung to that belief like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood, even as the cold waters of an inexplicable dread threatened to pull him under. The alternative was simply too disturbing to contemplate. Sleep offered Arthur little respite that night. When he finally drifted off, His dreams were a chaotic maelstrom of shadowy figures, rustling leaves, and the echoing sound of his own disembodied screams. He woke several times, drenched in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, the horrifying recording playing vividly in his mind's ear. Each time, the relief of realizing it was a dream was quickly supplanted by the chilling knowledge that the tape, and the voice it held, were real and waiting for him in the quiet kitchen. Morning arrived gray and somber, mirroring Arthur's mood. He forced himself through his usual routine: coffee, a piece of toast he barely tasted, his mind a battlefield of denial and a burgeoning, unwelcome fear. The tape recorder sat on the table, a silent accuser. He avoided looking at it directly, yet he was acutely aware of its presence, like a dormant threat. He knew he had to return to the woods. The thought filled him with a mixture of trepidation and a strange, almost compulsive need for answers. Perhaps, in the daylight, the spot where he found the recorder would offer some rational explanation. Maybe he would find footprints, evidence of other people, something to dispel the supernatural dread that was beginning to take root. The walk into Blackwood was different this time. The familiar paths seemed subtly altered, the trees more imposing, their shadows deeper and more complex. The usual sounds of the forest, the birdsong, the skittering of unseen creatures, seemed muted, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Or perhaps it was merely his perception, colored by the horror of the recording. He found himself jumpier than usual, starting at the sudden snap of a twig or the flight of a startled bird. It took him longer than he expected to locate the gnarled oak tree. The forest, despite his familiarity with it, seemed to disorient him, its paths twisting in unfamiliar ways. When he finally stood before it, the cluster of luridly red toadstools at its base seemed even more vibrant, almost pulsating with color against the muted greens and browns of the forest floor. He knelt, his gaze sweeping the ground, searching for anything he might have missed the day before. He meticulously examined the area around the tree, parting leaves sifting through the damp earth. There were no fresh footprints other than his own from the previous day. No discarded items, no signs of a struggle, nothing to indicate that any dramatic event, let alone the kind of terror captured on the tape, had taken place there. It was just another quiet, undisturbed corner of the vast forest. A profound sense of disappointment, mingled with a growing unease, settled over him. He had hoped for something, anything, to ground this mystery in the mundane. Instead, there was only the silent, indifferent woods. He looked at the tape recorder, still in his jacket pocket. He hadn't brought it with him. It was back at the cottage. The thought of playing it out here, in the very place it was found, sent a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. As he stood, a faint sound reached him. It was almost imperceptible at first, a low murmur, like distant voices carried on the wind. He strained his ears, turning his head. It seemed to come from deeper within the woods, from a direction he rarely ventured. Curiosity, or perhaps something less definable, a subtle pull, made him take a few hesitant steps in that direction. The murmuring grew slightly louder, resolving itself into what sounded like whispering. He couldn't make out any distinct words, just a soft, sibilant chorus. It was unsettling, the kind of sound that played at the edges of hearing, making him question if it was real or merely a product of his overactive imagination. He pushed through a thicket of ferns, the fronds brushing against his face, damp and cool. The whispering seemed to recede as he advanced, always just out of reach, luring him further into the denser, darker part of the forest. He stopped, a sense of foolishness washing over him. He was chasing phantoms, letting his fear get the better of him. There was probably a logical explanation: wind in the trees, water flowing over rocks, something perfectly natural. He turned to head back, but as he did, he noticed something new. Scratched into the bark of a nearby beech tree, at about eye level, was a crude symbol. It was a simple spiral, but there was something about its execution, deep, ragged gouges, as if carved with desperate haste or by an unsteady hand, that made him uneasy. He didn't recall seeing it before. He ran his fingers over the rough edges. It felt relatively fresh. He spent another hour combing the area, but found nothing more. The whispering had ceased, or perhaps he had simply stopped listening for it. The forest felt oppressive now, its silence no longer peaceful but charged with an unspoken tension. He retreated, a growing sense of disquietude dogging his steps. Back at the cottage, the ordinariness of his surroundings felt like a thin, fragile veneer over something deeply strange. He made himself lunch, trying to push the morning's fruitless search and the unsettling whispers from his mind. But the tape recorder on the table drew his gaze repeatedly. Later that afternoon, as he was attempting to lose himself in a book, he heard it again. A faint whisper, seemingly from within the cottage itself. He froze, his head snapping up. It was so soft he almost dismissed it as imagination, but then it came again, a sibilant breath of sound, too indistinct to be words, yet undeniably there. He stood up, slowly, his ears straining. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the kitchen. He walked cautiously towards the kitchen, his heart beginning to hammer against his ribs. The tape recorder lay on the table, inert. The whispering, if it had been real, was gone. Was he starting to lose his grip? Was the stress of the discovery manifesting as auditory hallucinations? It was a little disconcerting, he had to admit, this creeping sense that his own senses were becoming unreliable. He picked up the tape recorder, a sudden impulse seizing him. He rewound the tape, not to the beginning, but just a short way. He pressed play. Hiss. Then, faintly, almost buried beneath the static, he heard it. Not his screams this time, but a low, sibilant whispering, the same kind he thought he'd heard in the woods, and then, just moments ago, in his own home. It lasted only a few seconds before his own terrified voice cut in, louder and clearer than the whispers. He stabbed the stop button, his hand shaking. The whispers were on the tape. They were part of the recording. Had he just not noticed them before, overshadowed by the horror of his own screams? Or had they somehow appeared? The latter thought was absurd, yet it lodged in his mind, unsettling and persistent. The recording wasn't static. It felt as though it was subtly changing, revealing new layers of its disturbing narrative. The woods weren't just a backdrop. They were an active, listening participant. The days that followed were characterized by a gnawing anxiety that Arthur could not shake. The discovery of the faint whispers on the tape, seemingly interwoven with his own recorded screams, had added a new layer of profound disturbance to an already terrifying enigma. He listened to the tape countless times, each playback a fresh torment. Sometimes he thought the whispers were clearer, more defined, almost on the verge of forming words, but they always remained just beyond the threshold of comprehension, a sibilant, mocking chorus. Other times, they seemed fainter, more deeply buried in the static, making him question if he had truly heard them clearly before, or if his mind was playing tricks, embellishing the horror. He found himself becoming increasingly isolated, not just physically in his small cottage, but mentally as well. Who could he tell? Who would believe such a fantastic story? He imagined their reactions, polite disbelief, concerned glances, perhaps even suggestions that he seek professional help. The thought of their skepticism, their rational explanations that would inevitably fail to encompass the chilling reality of the tape, made him shrink further into himself. This was his burden to bear, his mystery to unravel, or his madness to endure. Sleep continued to be elusive, and when it did come, it was shallow and dream-plagued. The image of the spiral scratched into the beech tree recurred frequently, sometimes seeming to pulse with a faint, malevolent light. He started to notice spirals in other places too, in the whirls of wood grain on his table, the pattern of water draining from the sink, the coiling tendrils of climbing plants in his small garden. He knew, on some level, that this was pareidolia, his mind seeking patterns, obsessing over the symbol. But the knowledge did little to lessen the unsettling feeling that the symbol was somehow significant, a key he couldn't quite turn. The woods, his former sanctuary, now exerted a strange and conflicting influence over him. He was afraid of them, of what they might represent, of what might be waiting for him within their depths. Yet, at the same time, he felt an inexplicable pull, a compulsion to return, particularly to the area where he had found the recorder and seen the spiral. It was as if the forest itself was calling to him, whispering an invitation he found increasingly difficult to resist. He tried to fight it. He busied himself with tasks around the cottage, organized his bookshelves, even attempted to start a new woodworking project. But his focus was shattered. His thoughts would inevitably drift back to the tape, to the whispers, to the oppressive silence of Blackwood. He would find himself standing at the window, staring out at the tree-line, a knot of dread and a strange anticipation coiling in his stomach. The feeling was a little more than just curiosity now. It was becoming a need. One afternoon, a week after finding the recorder, the compulsion became overwhelming. The sky was overcast, the air heavy and still, the kind of day that often preceded a storm. He hadn't intended to go into the woods, had in fact resolved to stay away, to try and break the hold this mystery had on him. But he found himself pulling on his boots, shrugging into his jacket, the tape recorder, which he now carried with him almost constantly, a grim talisman, heavy in his pocket. He didn't consciously decide to go to the gnarled oak. His feet simply seemed to know the way, carrying him deeper and deeper into the forest with a surety that belied his internal turmoil. The woods were unnervingly quiet, the usual chorus of birds and insects conspicuously absent. Only the rustle of his own passage through the undergrowth broke the profound silence. When he reached the oak, it seemed darker, more gnarled than he remembered. The red toadstools at its base appeared almost luminous in the flat, gray light. He stood there for a long moment, his breath misting in the cool air, a sense of foreboding washing over him. What was he doing here? What did he expect to find? He reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the cold plastic of the tape recorder. He hadn't played it out here before. The idea had always seemed too potent, too risky. But now, standing in the very spot where this whole nightmare had begun, the urge was irresistible. His hand trembled as he raised the recorder and pressed play. The familiar hiss filled the silence, louder here, it seemed, in the absence of any other sound. Then the click, the fumbling. He braced himself for his own screams. But what came next was different. The whispers started first, clearer than he had ever heard them on previous playbacks, no longer a sibilant chorus but distinct, though still incomprehensible, words. They seemed to swirl around him, as if emanating not just from the small speaker of the recorder, but from the very trees themselves. And then, a new sound, something he hadn't heard before, a low, guttural growl, followed by a sharp crack, like a branch snapping. His blood ran cold. This wasn't on the tape before. He was certain of it. He would have remembered. Then, his own voice, not screaming, not yet, but panting, breathless. "It's here," his recorded self whispered, his voice tight with terror. "It found me." Arthur stared at the recorder in his hand, his mind reeling. The tape was changing. The recording wasn't a fixed event. It was evolving, revealing more of the horror. The implications were staggering, terrifying. Was it a premonition that updated itself? Or was he somehow influencing it by being here? Before he could process the thought, before his recorded self could scream, A loud snap from the trees directly behind him made him whirl around, his heart leaping into his throat. There was nothing there. Just the dense, silent woods. But the sound had been real, sharp and close. He was no longer alone in his listening. Something was out there. Or perhaps, something had been drawn by the act of playing the tape in this specific, charged location. The forest felt suddenly, actively hostile. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had to get out, now. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Arthur's bewildered horror. The snap of the branch behind him, whether real or a trick of his frayed nerves, coupled with the evolving terror on the tape, shattered his remaining composure. He fumbled with the stop button on the recorder, his fingers clumsy and slick with a sudden sweat. The device clattered from his grasp, falling amongst the damp leaves and lurid toadstools at the base of the gnarled oak. He didn't stop to retrieve it. His only instinct was to flee. He turned and plunged back the way he had come, or what he thought was the way. The familiar paths seemed to have vanished, the trees closing in around him, their branches like skeletal arms reaching out to ensnare him. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of timber in the wind, sounded like pursuit. He could almost feel hot breath on the back of his neck, hear the faint, sibilant whispers he'd heard on the tape now seeming to emanate from the very air around him, carried on the oppressive stillness of the forest. He ran blindly, heedless of the branches that whipped at his face and tore at his clothes. His breath came in ragged gasps, his lungs burning. The rational part of his mind, small and besieged, screamed at him to stop, to think, to get his bearings. But the primal fear, the same terror he had heard in his own voice on that cursed recording, had taken control. He was no longer Arthur, the quiet, contemplative man of the woods. He was prey, fleeing an unseen, unknown hunter. How long he ran, he couldn't say. Time seemed to stretch and distort. The forest became a disorienting labyrinth of identical trees and shifting shadows. He stumbled over roots, his ankles twisting, his knees jarring with impact, but he scrambled up each time, driven onward by the relentless dread. At one point he tripped badly, sprawling headlong into a thicket of ferns. The impact knocked the air from his lungs, and he lay there for a moment, gasping, his cheek pressed against the cool, damp earth. The scent of decaying leaves filled his nostrils. It was in that moment, as he fought to draw breath, that he heard it clearly, not from a tape, not from his imagination, but from the woods around him, his own voice, raw with terror, screaming, "Help me! Oh, please, someone help!" He froze, the sound an icy spear through his heart. It was coming from somewhere nearby, to his left. His recording. But he had dropped the tape recorder back at the gnarled oak. How could it be playing? Then the terrible realization dawned, crashing down with the weight of inescapable fate. This was it. This was what the tape had recorded. He wasn't listening to a premonition anymore. He was living it. A choked sob escaped him. He pushed himself up, his body trembling uncontrollably. He had to get away from the sound of his own screams, a sound that now heralded not a past or future event, but the terrifying present. "No! Please, no! Get away from me! Somebody, help!" His own voice, filled with an agony he was only now beginning to truly comprehend, echoed through the trees. He scrambled to his feet and ran again. But now his flight had a new, horrifying dimension. He was running from himself, from the sounds he was apparently, at this very moment, making. The whispers seemed louder too, swirling around him, a cacophony of sibilant, almost gleeful sounds. He could feel a presence behind him, vast and ancient, and utterly indifferent to his suffering, or perhaps the very source of it. He didn't dare look back. He stumbled into a small clearing, his legs threatening to buckle beneath him. He was exhausted, terrified, his mind struggling to grasp the impossible reality of his situation. He leaned against a tree, gasping for air, his eyes darting wildly around. Where was it? What was causing this? And then he saw it. Not a monster, not a tangible threat, but something far more insidious. Nestled at the base of a beech tree on the far side of the clearing, half hidden by ferns, was a small, gray, portable tape recorder. His tape recorder. The one he had dropped. Or was it? It looked identical. With a dawning, soul-crushing horror, he understood. Or at least, he understood the mechanics of his terror, if not its ultimate cause. He was the source of the recording. He was creating it, right now. His current panic, his screams for help that he was vaguely aware of uttering between gasps and sobs, were being captured. The fumbling sounds he'd heard at the beginning of the tape, that would be him, in a few moments, perhaps, discovering the recorder again, trying to make it work, just as he had done before. The loop. It was a loop. He was trapped. Trapped in a cycle of fear, a self-fulfilling prophecy etched onto magnetic tape and played out in the sentient, watching heart of Blackwood Forest. The spiral he had seen carved into the tree, it was a symbol of this, of the endless, repeating nature of his torment. A despair colder and deeper than any fear he had yet experienced washed over him. His screams died in his throat, replaced by a whimpering sound. He sank to his knees, his gaze fixed on the tape recorder across the clearing. The whispers in the woods intensified, seeming to laugh at him. He didn't know how long he knelt there, broken. Eventually, a strange calm, the calm of utter hopelessness, settled over him. He knew what he had to do. Or rather, what he would do. What he was always destined to do. Slowly, shakily, he got to his feet. He walked across the clearing, his movements stiff and automaton-like. He bent down and picked up the tape recorder. Its plastic casing was cool in his trembling hand. He pressed the eject button. The cassette, with its blank, yellowed label, popped out. He stared at it for a long moment. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of eternity, he pushed it back in, closed the compartment, and pressed the record button. He had to ensure the cycle continued. Or perhaps, the forest ensured it. He then began to scream, a ragged, tearing sound that was a perfect echo of the voice he'd first heard in the safety of his kitchen. He screamed for help, knowing no help would come. He begged for mercy from an entity he could not see or understand. He was creating this silver recording, ensuring another unsuspecting soul, perhaps another version of himself in some future iteration of this nightmare, would find it and begin the cycle anew. The forest listened, and recorded, and waited.